Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the ancient Mediterranean world, where a single inked dot on a Roman map conjures a mystery so large it has survived centuries. Imagine yourself staring at a parchment chart laid out on a wooden table by lamplight seas, traced in blue coastlines, etched in firm brown lines, and there between the familiar contours of Iberia and the vast Atlantic sights a speck of land. The Romans gave it a name, drew its silhouette, and spoke of it with confidence. Yet here's the catch: you could sail the oceans until your arms ache from rowing, and you probably won't survive the storms, and still you would never find this place. It is the Phantom Island mapped, but never again seen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And since I love to know who's drifting along with me, post your location and your local time down below. Now find yourself a cozy seat or a soft bed, let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in Rome during the height of its empire, when senators debated politics beneath marble colonnades, and cartographers hunched over their wax tablets, translating sailors' reports into carefully inked charts. Rome thrived on order, on cataloguing the known world, on labelling even the farthest shores. But order sometimes collides with the unknown, and this Phantom Island was one of those collisions. The name island itself shifted through the centuries, but most sources place it somewhere west of the Iberian Peninsula, a tantalizing step between Europe and the endless horizon. Roman cartographers were no amateurs. They leaned on Greek precedents, drawing from the work of men like Strabo, who wrote vast geographical commentaries. Strabo, for instance, admitted that much of the Atlantic was a place of rumour, but he still copied tales of strange lands carried by Phoenician traders. The Romans inherited that habit. They trusted mariners more than poets, but not by much. And so when a captain stumbled back into port with a story of a green-forested island glimpsed before storms drove him home, the scribes sharpened their styluses. A tiny dot appeared on a map, and with that the Phantom Island entered history. Mainstream fact steadies us here. Roman maps often included places that were hearsay rather than verified. Ancient geography was a patchwork, part accurate surveying, part gossip. The Putinga table, a surviving Roman map, shows routes and cities across the empire, but the edges of the world are hazier where imagination fills the gaps. Historians still argue whether these Phantom Islands were ever based on real land masses like the Azores or Madeira, or whether they were simply mirages magnified into legend. The story becomes quirkier when one considers how such places were proven. Roman authors had a taste for inserting anecdotes. Pliny, the elder encyclopedist par excellence, catalogued islands where sheep supposedly grew fleeces of gold and where people never aged. If Pliny didn't outright invent the Phantom Island, he at least made readers comfortable with believing in it. An ordinary Roman sipping watered wine in smoky taverns needed little encouragement to imagine a stepping stone across the Western Sea, perhaps even a route to unimaginable wealth. Picture the scene: sailors standing by the docks in Cadiz, telling wide-eyed listeners about sudden mountains rising from mist, their peaks capped with green forests, their coasts lined with black cliffs. Sometimes they claimed to have landed, though conveniently their memories always blurred about what lay inland. Other times they swore that the island drifted like a phantom, one day there, the next gone. The audience laughed, but also leaned closer, because what if there's a playful superstition here? Sailors often blamed their inability to find the island again on divine trickery. Neptune, they said, guarded certain places with veils of fog, allowing only the chosen to see them. Or perhaps Jupiter planted such illusions to remind mortals that they were never fully in charge of the seas. These explanations sound fanciful to us, but to a Roman audience they added credibility. After all, the gods meddled in everything from dice games to Senate debates. Why not in navigation? The Phantom Island story also served a social function. For senators, it was an excuse to lecture about Rome's destiny. If the gods showed a new land, perhaps it was fated for conquest. For poets, it was an easy metaphor for desire forever out of reach, like a lover glimpsed at twilight and lost at dawn. For merchants, it was a juicy sales pitch: invest in my ship, and maybe we'll find that island rich in timber and furs. And for the common people, it was bedtime entertainment, a way to dream of distant adventures without leaving their smoky courtyards. Quirky as it sounds, there is even a tale of a Roman patrol ship chasing what they thought was the Phantom Island itself, only to realise after hours of rowing that they were pursuing a drifting fog bank. The captain, embarrassed, claimed he had been testing the men's stamina. The crew, less diplomatic, claimed they had seen land vanish before their very eyes. Which version made it into the archives? The more dramatic one, of course, of This constant dance between rumour and record shaped the way Rome saw its empire. The Phantom Island was more than a dot on a map. It was a mirror of Roman ambition. If it existed, it could be conquered. If it vanished, it became a reminder that Rome, mighty as it was, did not control the seas beyond Gibraltar. The Strait of Hercules, the Pillars of Hercules as they called it, was the edge of their certainty. Beyond lay monsters, whirlpools, and perhaps a speck of land waiting to mock them. And so late at night, when senators walked home from debates and glanced westward into the dusk, they carried with them the image of that phantom place. A place that proved both the reach and the limits of empire. A place that lived in memory in maps, in tavern talk, but never in reality. The story drifts now like a ship caught in currents toward the first great attempts to pin down the island's location. Out past the Pillars of Hercules, where the cliffs of Iberia fall away and the Atlantic begins to breathe in long, patient swells, crews ease their merchant ships into the open water and watch the world turn unfamiliar. They sail in vessels with bellies wide for cargo and masts rigged with square sails that snap like banners when the wind swings right. Ropes creak, gulls wheel, and the helmsman, whose hands are more rope than skin, squints along the western horizon until his eyelids feel salted shut. They are hunting an island that refuses to be found, a patch of green that appears in one story and evaporates in the next, a place the sea reveals the way a stage magician shows a coin, only to take it away with a smile that is almost kind. They have tricks for reading the ocean. The steersman tastes the air and declares it sweeter. A deckhand notices clumps of seaweed tangled like old hair. Someone hears distant breakers like a constant whisper behind heavy curtains. In the dawn, seabirds sometimes arrive in spurts, skimming the wave crests with the confidence of creatures who know where breakfast lives. Sailors swear that birds do not fly far from land unless bribed with fish, and when 3, then 4, then 7 appear, well, that must mean a shoreline is nearby. They trim sail and alter course by a finger's width, which at sea can mean dozens of kilometres, dozens of miles over a day. Toward evening the weather draws a veil. Mist builds from nothing, and out of the mist rises a shape ridge-backed dark at the base with a smudge of paler tone along the top as if sunlit grass crowns a basalt spine. The lookout perched in the swaying top shouts until his voice cracks. Men surge forward, leaning past the rail, as though 2 bodies and 1 heartbeat might somehow reach farther. The helmsman answers with a steady hand, and an order keeper on that bearing let the current work for us. On a fair wind, a Roman merchantman might cover 150 to 200 kilometres, roughly 90 to 120 miles in a day. On this night, the sea decides the number will be smaller. By midnight, the wind dies. The swell rolls under them like the breath of a sleeping animal, and the island blurs into a larger darkness beyond normal darkness. A faint smell of damp soil creeps across the water, or perhaps that is wishful thinking mixed with tar and pitch. A second lookout swears he hears frogs. Everyone else swears he needs fewer cups of wine. Jokes like that are easier at night under stars so crisp they seem carved into the dome when the ocean is too quiet and the mind is too loud. Mainstream fact steadies this slow chase. Ancient crews navigating the Atlantic relied on coastal sailing. Celestial cues and practical signs, birds floating, vegetation colour, changes in the water, long swells that hint at open ocean versus nearshore chop. Greek and Roman writers mention voyages beyond the strait, and later sources place the Fortunate Isles somewhere to the southwest, which many associate with the Canary Islands. Historians still argue whether Roman sailors truly reached Madeira or the Azores, or whether mariners only brushed past the nearer islands and then inflated memory with hope. The Phantom Island floats in that gap between practical seamanship and the hunger for discovery. Dawnlight peels back the sky like a lid. The men rub their eyes, turn toward where the shape should be, and find sunlight rinsing an unbroken horizon. No ridge, no pale crown, no friendly flocks wheeling back toward nests. The helmsman mutters about fog banks that mimic cliffs. A priest murmurs that the gods test mortal patience. The ship's cook, trying to keep spirits up, claims the island stepped out for breakfast and will return in time for lunch. It does not. They do not give up easily. The captain orders a new tack, then another, chasing any clue the sea will give line of foam that behaves like surf, a glassy patch that might be a sheltered bay, the sudden briny scent that is definitely not the cargo hold. They cross and recross the room of last night's sighting until the deck tracks shine, and every line hums from constant adjustments. The current slides them south, then west, then south again. The ocean, polite but firm, shepherds them like an absent-minded beast nudging strays. At last they turn for home, persuading themselves that distance and daylight conspire to hide what night generously showed. Back in port, where fishmongers shout and amphorae clink, the story expands like dough in warm air. Land was seen, says the lookout. Trees were visible, adds a deckhand. A waterfall sang to us, insists the priest who does not usually hear waterfalls. The captain stands with arms folded, adding nothing but allowing everything, because a little legend improves crew morale and future contracts. The ship's owner nods along, calculating, while a scribe scratches notes on a wax tablet, for some mapmaker who buys sailors' tales the way bakers buy grain. On the next voyage, a different crew tries a different tactic. They follow birds that look purposeful, mark their heading against the evening star, and hold a steady speed as long as the wind behaves. Someone drops a weighted line overboard not to sound depth. The ocean here is fathoms beyond fathoms, but to feel the direction of the undercurrent in the tug of hemp. At dusk, a low arc appears, and for once the outline holds not a fog trick, but something more stubborn. The sea darkens around it, while the sky keeps the island edged in gold. Men who have long practiced not blinking forget how to blink. Then the air grows peculiar the way it does before a summer storm. The horizon thickens, lightning flickers without thunder, and a ghostly blue fire crawls along the yardarms. Sailors call it a blessing when they are brave, and a warning when they are not. They furl canvas in jerks and snatches, whispering little charms against bad luck, while the captain, who considers himself rational, quietly touches the amulet under his tunic. The island, so solid a heartbeat ago, softens into suggestion. Rain strides out across the water like a curtain drawn by a patient hand. The ship rocks in long, indifferent strokes. When the squall passes, all that remains is an empty reach of ocean, and a crew with more story than proof. Quirky tidbits cling to these attempts like barnacles. One helmsman insists he can smell fresh leaves from 30 kilometres, about 19 miles if the wind sits just right. A pilot from Gades keeps a tiny pot of soil on board and plants seeds in it at the start of every voyage. He claims that when sprouts appear, land must be near. They never sprout at sea, but his passengers adore the performance. A drummer swears beating a steady rhythm persuades the current to cooperate. The sea, indifferent to percussion, keeps time with its own deep drums. Between expeditions, men gather in low-ceiling taverns lit by smoky lamps and draw the island in spilled wine on the tables. They argue over its size, some say a day's march across, others say the size of Sardinia, and point to bearings with greasy fingers. The sensible ones quote, "Distances with fair weather a ship can average perhaps 10 kilometres per hour, about 6 miles per hour, so from the Strait a 2-day run could put them 300 to 400 kilometres, about 186 to 249 miles into the open." The dreamers counter with what they prefer, a place where soft water spills down black cliffs and trees lean toward the sea as if listening for guests. Declarations grow grander when the wine flows. Truth thins out like watered stew. A final attempt months later brings the most maddening result. The crew sights land at twilight, and this time smells wood smoke. They row until blisters tear open, chasing a dark shore stitched with brighter stitches that might be fires. The captain swears he sees a beach. The young sailor swears he hears a dog. The older men roll their eyes because Atlantic winds can fold sound and carry it like a trick. Then stars appear one by one, and the stitches reclassify themselves as constellations tipping toward the water. What they thought were fires were reflections. What they thought was surf song is their own wake slapping the hull. The night smiles and closes its hand. By the time the battered ship glides back into its harbour, the Phantom Island has become both embarrassment and treasure. Embarrassment because it refuses to stand still and be mapped treasure, because every failed sighting is somehow sweeter to tell. Mainstream fact returns quiet and persuasive. Rome's mariners knew coasts best, while the veering Atlantic with its canary current and shifting fogs loved to lay mirages upon the eye. Historians still argue whether those silhouettes were the nearer Fortunate Isles glimpsed from odd angles or cloud mountains piled by light, or a wish given temporary shape by mist. The crews do not argue. They point to the place in their memory where the horizon took a breath and lifted into land, and they offer the only evidence. They have a thin line of hope that refuses to break. In the quieter corners of Rome, far from the docks and the boastful chatter of sailors, the mystery of the Phantom Island slips into the hands of scholars. They sit in shaded libraries where light filters through narrow windows and dust motes hang like tiny stars above rolls of papyrus. These men trained in rhetoric and steeped in history are less impressed by tavern boasts, and more concerned with shaping knowledge into ordered lines. When news arrives that sailors insist they have seen a strange island vanish into the mist, the geographers do not laugh it off. Instead, they sharpen their styluses, unfurl their charts, and begin to debate whether the island deserves a place in the world Rome claims to know. The library air smells of ink and beeswax, and while it is quieter than a ship's deck, the arguments here have just as much turbulence. A mainstream fact anchors this debate Rome inherited and refined much of its geographic understanding from the Greeks. The works of Ptolemy Strabo and earlier thinkers such as Eratosthenes set the foundations for how Romans measured the world. They mapped provinces, traced trade routes, and calculated distances with surprising accuracy, at least when rivers and well-travelled roads were involved. Yet the seas remained places of mystery. Beyond the familiar Mediterranean, their knowledge grew sketchier, based on second-hand reports, merchants' exaggerations, or soldiers' hurried notes, while marching along storm-lashed coasts. The Phantom Island entered this patchwork not as an oddity, but as one more thread that might or might not fit the larger weave. Quill-scratch voices rise and wax tablets fill with speculation. Some scholars insist the sailors must have mistaken a bank of clouds for land. Others argue that shifting sandbars, those fickle children of the sea, can appear solid before sinking again beneath the waves. A more daring voice suggests volcanic smoke might trick the eye, rising from far-off fissures like dark mountains glimpsed through the haze. Historians still argue whether such explanations are rationalizations after the fact, one scholar mutters, or whether the sea truly hides secrets that mock our maps. His colleague answers with a shrug, as if to say the line between mystery and mistake is thinner than parchment. One quirky tidbit slides into the discussion delivered with half a smirk. A clerk sorting through an older roll reads aloud a marginal note scrawled by some long-dead scribe: "Beware islands that move like herds of cattle." The scholars chuckle amused at the image of Rome's serious navigators chasing a stampede of migrating landmasses. Yet even in their laughter lies unease, because the comparison is not entirely absurd. The sea does shift like a living thing. Its fogs roll like beasts, its tides stomp forward, and its islands, at least in rumour, wander as if grazing from one horizon to the next. The debate is not merely academic. In Rome, knowledge is power. To place an island on the map is to stake a claim over the unknown, to say this belongs to us, even if only on parchment. Senators know that merchants will use these maps to plan routes, and generals will consult them when dreaming of conquest. If the Phantom Island exists, it is an opportunity. If it does not, it is a trap waiting to embarrass those too quick to believe. Scholars feel the pressure of this responsibility. Their debates carry the weight of empire, for their ink may direct fleets, and their hesitation may stall ventures. Picture the room: one man in a saffron cloak leans over the table, tapping the chart where the Atlantic stretches wide and vague. He argues for caution. Another, draped in indigo, insists on boldness: mark the island, and let sailors prove it, or perish, trying. A third scratches at his beard and proposes compromise: a dotted outline, a ghostly placeholder that admits uncertainty, without denying the possibility. Even as their words clash, they are united by one truth: the sea is larger than Rome, and no matter how many scrolls they fill, it will always keep some secrets beyond reach. As the day deepens and oil lamps replace the sun, the library fills with the sweet smell of smoke. The scholars are weary, yet the island haunts them. One recalls that Greek legends spoke of lost lands swallowed by the sea. Atlantis most famously, but also lesser-known isles whispered about by sailors. Another claims he has seen fragments of Iberian maps that mention shadow islands west of the Pillars of Hercules. The Phantom Isle, then, is not just a Roman curiosity, but part of a larger tradition of lands that beckon and vanish like sirens calling with cartographic voices. The arguments grow theatrical. A geographer holds up a blank sheet of parchment declaring, "Here is your island, it is whatever you want it to be." His colleagues groan, but the point strikes home. Without proof, the island is imagination pinned to paper. Yet imagination has its own power. Merchants dream of new harbours, emperors dream of new conquests, and poets dream of a place where myths hide just beyond the horizon. The Phantom Isle feeds them all, whether real or not. And so the scholar's verdict is neither yes nor no. They decide reluctantly to mark the island faintly on certain maps with notes warning of uncertainty. This compromise allows sailors to chase or ignore it as they please, while scholars can claim prudence either way. It is an academic sleight of hand. The island exists in ink, but only as a whisper. a possibility, a question disguised as a coastline. Future generations will inherit this uncertainty, squinting at maps and wondering if Rome knew something we do not, or if Rome simply loved a good story as much as we do now. As the lamps burn low, the scholars close their scrolls and lean back, eyes tired, but minds restless. Outside, the night air hums with cicadas, and the Tiber reflects a ribbon of moonlight. In their hearts, each scholar carries his own version of the Phantom Isle. One sees a misty shore, another sees a mirage, a third sees nothing but error. Yet none of them dismiss it entirely. The sea is too wide, Rome is too small, and mystery is too stubborn to be denied. By the time dawn creeps in and clerks return to sweep the floors, the Phantom Island is already drifting again, not on the waves this time, but through the minds of men who cannot stop debating. Perhaps that is its truest form, not a stretch of land anchored in the ocean, but a shape of thought slipping between certainty and doubt, always moving, always just beyond reach. The Phantom Island refuses to remain only ink and whispers. As months turn into years, the story of its possible existence bleeds from the neat columns of scholarly debate into the looser, wilder language of prophecy. Rome, after all, is not merely an empire of soldiers and roads. It is also an empire of omens. Citizens glance at the flight of birds before making decisions, senators consult augurs when debating laws, and generals hesitate if lightning splits the sky at the wrong time. In such a culture, it is hardly surprising that an island no one can quite find again becomes entwined with the Sibylline verses those cryptic prophecies said to guide the destiny of Rome. Tonight we wander into that strange zone where cartography and mysticism collide. Imagine a scroll resting in the shadowy archives of the Capitoline Hill, its words obscure, its lines filled with riddles. A priest draped in russet robes reads by lamplight, "Beware the land that rises and falls with the breath of gods, for in its appearing lies both wealth and ruin." Quirky as it sounds, this kind of imagery is not out of place in the Sibylline tradition. Historians still argue whether such verses were genuinely ancient, or whether later Romans added convenient lines to suit political needs. Yet even skeptics admit that fragments of these oracles carried immense weight. If senators believed that the mysterious island matched a cryptic verse, the phantom was no longer a curiosity but a divine warning. Mainstream fact steadies us here. The Sibylline books, or their later copies, were indeed consulted during crises. Roman officials turned to them in times of plague, famine, and invasion, hoping for divine guidance. Their instructions could be oddly specific, introducing foreign cults performing particular rituals or building new temples. The texts held sway not because everyone understood them clearly, but because their obscurity allowed interpreters to link them to whatever crisis loomed. It is not difficult to see how a vanishing island reported by sailors and whispered among scholars could be grafted onto such verses. One fringe tale, preserved in the writings of a later chronicler, insists that the Phantom Island was destined to appear only at Rome's most perilous hour. According to this version, the island would rise like a whale, breaching the sea, bringing with it secrets of victory or doom. Picture the senator's robes pulled tight, listening in uneasy silence, as a trembling augur warns that the empire's fate might rest upon land no one can locate. The thought is as absurd as it is terrifying, an empire of legions reduced to waiting on the whim of a vanishing coastline. Yet prophecy has its charms. Imagine a merchant on the docks telling his workers, "We must be ready. The island foretold by the Sibyl may bring us fortunes." His words are half jest, half hope, and his audience laughs nervously as they hoist amphorae of olive oil onto ships. Even in jest, though, the prophecy feeds imagination. Sailors whisper that the island contains temples where gods walk, or caverns where gold gleams in torchlight. Children repeat tales of a land that appears only at night, or only when the moon is full, or only to the eyes of the pure. Each retelling makes the island less a place and more a stage for Rome's deepest anxieties and desires. Quirky details surface in unexpected corners. A satirist known for mocking the Senate jokes that the Phantom Isle is where all unpaid taxes go to hide. A poet muses that the island is actually a giant turtle, surfacing when it pleases and sinking when tired of Roman arrogance. An augur less humorous claims that during an eclipse he saw a shadow on the sea shaped like land. He writes solemnly in his notebook that this must be the island, a sign that Rome should heed divine warnings. Whether he believed his own words or merely sought prestige is impossible to know. Historians still argue whether augurs were sincere interpreters or clever manipulators who wrapped politics in the cloak of religion. Meanwhile, the island becomes a pawn in political theatre. Senators opposing a policy might declare that the Sibylline books warned against voyages westward, lest Rome anger the gods of the ocean. Their rivals counter by proclaiming that the same texts predicted triumph if Rome boldly sought out the phantom shore. The ambiguity of prophecy makes it the perfect weapon. Both sides can quote it, both sides can claim divine approval, and no one can disprove it. After all, the island is missing, and what is missing can be imagined in whatever form is useful. Picture the scene in the Senate. A stern man in saffron rises, scroll in hand, and declares that the phantom island is a warning. His opponent, draped in indigo, smirks and insists it is a promise. Their voices echo off marble walls, while scribes try to keep up quills scratching furiously. Outside in the forum, common citizens spread their own versions, passing the tale like bread at a feast. By nightfall, the island has become both curse and blessing, both omen and opportunity. This duality keeps the mystery alive. If the island is real, then its absence is proof of divine secrecy. If it is false, then its very falseness serves as proof of Rome's capacity for imaginative politics. Either way, it remains a story too juicy to abandon. Rome thrives on spectacle, and the Phantom Island becomes one more stage on which ambition, superstition, and rhetoric perform their endless play. As the sun sets over the Tiber and lamps glow in temples, priests chant verses that may or may not refer to the sea. Citizens drift home, their sandals clicking on stones, repeating fragments of prophecy, an island that appears only to the doomed, a land that hides wealth beyond measure, a place where gods test mortals. Each phrase floats like ash in the air, impossible to pin down, irresistible to repeat. And so, the Phantom Island slips deeper into the collective mind, not just a line on a map, but a verse in Rome's eternal song of fate. The Phantom Island drifts from prophecy into commerce, for merchants are not immune to mystery, especially when it promises profit. In the bustling harbours of Ostia and Puteoli, men in tunics of russet and teal lean over ledgers, their voices competing with the squawk of gulls and the slap of waves against wooden hulls. They hear sailors whisper of a land just beyond reach, a place glimpsed but never anchored upon, and where sailors see fog and uncertainty, merchants see opportunity. Perhaps the Phantom Island holds forests ripe for shipbuilding, or mines glittering with silver, or pastures where strange animals graze. The dream spreads across amphorae stacked high, with wine and oil across coins exchanged for exotic spices, and across charts smudged with salt and ink. Mainstream fact steadies us here. Rome's economy thrived on maritime trade, with routes stretching across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. Grain from Egypt, tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, and silks that travelled across continents all found their way into Roman markets. Merchants relied on networks of sailors, shipbuilders and financiers, and though they valued reliability, they were also lured by rumour. When word came of the Phantom Isle, they calculated risks and rewards with the same fervour as they counted amphorae of olive oil. For them, the sea was not merely water, it was a spreadsheet, each new harbour a potential column of profit. One quirky tidbit survives in a fragmentary satire. A merchant supposedly invested heavily in ships, destined to sail toward the Phantom Island, convinced it contained fields of grain that could rival Egypt's. When the ships returned with nothing but seasick sailors and empty holds, his rivals mocked him as Lord of the Invisible Harvest. The nickname stuck at least until another rumour came along to distract the city. Laughter, after all, is cheaper than failure, and Rome had an endless appetite for both. Still, not every merchant dismissed the idea after one failure. Some doubled down, arguing that treasures worth finding were always hard to reach. Others pointed to the way new lands had entered Roman knowledge before Britain once seemed a myth, yet legions now tramped its damp soil. Historians still argue whether comparisons like these were sincere hopes or clever justifications for reckless investments, one chronicler writes. Either way, the merchants' willingness to gamble ensured that the Phantom Island did not fade quickly from memory. Picture the warehouses along the Tiber wicker baskets filled with figs, jars sealed with pitch slaves carrying sacks of grain. Amid the everyday bustle, whispers circulate. A man in indigo leans close to another, speaking of an island with harbours deep enough to shelter fleets. A listener's eyes gleam not because he believes, but because he knows belief can be sold. Merchants do not need certainty. They need stories strong enough to attract backers with gold. The Phantom Island becomes less a destination than a brand, a name that convinces wealthy citizens to part with their coins in hopes of future fortune. The sea, of course, resists commodification. Gales scatter ships, currents twist like serpents, and pirates wait along coasts with sharpened blades. Yet merchants persuade themselves that the risks are the same as any other venture. They cite past successes: tin from Cornwall pearls from the Red Sea, pepper from India. Why not wood silver or grain from this Phantom Isle? They argue, scribbling contracts in wax and shaking hands over amphorae of Falernian wine. Dreams taste better when washed down with alcohol, and Rome's merchants were rarely sober for long. A fringe story claims that one group of investors actually funded a fleet of 3 ships to chase the island. The ships sailed westward past the Pillars of Hercules and vanished for nearly a year. When they finally returned, battered and nearly empty, the captains reported storms, strange birds and horizons that shimmered like molten bronze, but no land. Their failure did little to dampen enthusiasm. Instead, storytellers embroidered their tales, insisting the island was real, but evasive, visible only under certain stars or seasons. If a merchant lost money, he could console himself with the thought that his ships had at least brushed the hem of mystery. Back in Rome, senators sometimes mocked these commercial gambles, yet they too benefited. Every rumour about the island encouraged new expeditions, and every expedition enriched shipbuilders, dock workers and financiers. Even failures put food on tables, for someone had to bake bread for the sailors, stitch sails for the ships and haul supplies down to the water. The Phantom Island thus fueled Rome's economy, not with actual resources but with the churn of preparation. In this way, illusion became industry. Quirky humour ran alongside ambition. In one tavern, a drunken storyteller claimed the island was inhabited entirely by parrots who shouted prices of goods louder than Roman auctioneers. The patrons roared with laughter, raising cups of watered wine. In another corner, a wit suggested that the Phantom Island was actually a floating warehouse, drifting away each time tax collectors approached. Even satire helped keep the story alive, because laughter still plants images in memory. Once an island exists in the imagination, it is hard to erase. The merchants, practical though they were, had no illusions about the sea's cruelty. They calculated, gambled, and sometimes lost everything. Yet even loss became fuel for further rumour if the island had not been found. Surely it was because the wrong men searched, or the wrong season was chosen, or the gods had withheld favour. The island's absence never disproved its existence. It merely delayed discovery. In that sense, the Phantom Isle was the perfect investment, endlessly postponable, eternally profitable in stories, if not in goods. By the time night settles over the docks and the day's trade quiets, the Phantom Island has already earned its keep, not in grain or silver, but in imagination. Merchants sleep with dreams of profits that might arrive tomorrow. Senators joke about invisible harvests, and sailors plan to try again with stronger ships. The Phantom Island drifts on, not across the sea this time, but across the ledgers, and hopes of men who see mystery not as danger, but as opportunity. The Phantom Island does not stay confined to merchants' ledgers or scholars' scrolls. It drifts into the hands of Rome's generals. These are men whose lives revolve around maps, logistics, and the art of making terrain bend to ambition. For them, the sea is not only a trade route, but a potential battlefield, and every coastline is a chessboard square that might hold advantage or threat. When rumours reach them that an island has been spotted, and then lost, their eyes narrow. What if this land lies in a strategic position, guarding unseen currents or offering a staging ground for fleets? Even if it exists only in rumour, they must consider its implications, for generals know that ignoring whispers can be as dangerous as ignoring enemy banners. Mainstream fact grounds us here. Rome's military machine was fueled by careful planning. Campaigns were supported by supply lines, stretching hundreds of kilometres, hundreds of miles, with wagons creaking under grain and amphorae of oil. When fleets were involved, the challenge grew even more daunting. Ships needed harbours, fresh water and sheltered anchorages. A real island, even a modest one, could change strategy overnight. Historians still argue whether Roman naval commanders genuinely searched for such phantom islands, or whether these stories remained theoretical musings, but the strategic interest is undeniable. A new landmass meant options, and generals always sought options. One quirky tidbit whispered in later accounts tells of a commander who allegedly ordered scouts to spend weeks patrolling the western horizon, convinced that the island might serve as a secret supply base. His soldiers joked that they were not serving Rome's eagle but chasing seagulls. The jest turned into a campfire refrain. If the island appears, may it at least offer wine. Soldiers laughed, though they grumbled at the wasted effort. Still, the very fact that men were dispatched in search of it suggests the island was taken seriously enough to shape real orders. Imagine a council of officers gathered in a tent, wax tablets spread across a low table. One draped in a cloak of indigo trimmed with bronze insists the island could be used to outflank enemies in Hispania. Another in russet with a scar across his cheek argues that it might be a staging point for expeditions deeper into the Atlantic, perhaps even toward lands beyond anyone's imagining. A third frowns, tapping a stylus reminding them that chasing ghosts can drain resources. Yet even as he protests, he cannot fully dismiss the thought. A phantom island on a map may be a phantom, but it still tugs at strategy like a loose thread pulling at a cloak. Generals understood numbers, and they did not laugh at the scale. If a legion of 5,000 men requires roughly 5,000 kilograms, about 11,000 pounds of grain each day, then any harbour capable of storing extra supplies becomes critical. A hidden island could mean survival during long campaigns. Some even speculated that if the island held forests, its timber might feed shipyards, sparing Rome from the expensive task of importing wood from afar. In the arithmetic of war, even rumour had weight. Of course, some commanders mocked the obsession. A satirist later claimed that one general proposed building a triumphal arch in honour of the island, even though it had never been found. The soldiers, he said, suggested engraving an empty panel in the middle of the arch to symbolise its invisible conquest. It was a jest, but like all good jests, it pointed toward truth. Generals could not resist dreaming of victories even over things that might not exist. Historians still argue whether certain Roman expeditions westward were truly about conquest, or whether they masked reconnaissance missions searching for this elusive land. The lack of clear evidence leaves the debate unsettled. Some suggest the voyages were genuine attempts to expand knowledge. Others believe they were excuses for commanders to seek glory or distract from failures. In the silence of history, motives blur like distant horizons. Picture the soldiers themselves standing on a shoreline at dusk watching waves crash. Their armour gleams faintly in the fading light. Some squint at the horizon, convinced they see a shadow of land. Others mutter that the only islands out there are made of cloud and wishful thinking. A centurion, weary of their chatter, orders them back to camp, grumbling that Rome's power does not rest on chasing mirages. Yet even as they leave, more than one turns to glance again just in case. Quirky rumours colour the tale further. One story claims a general secretly hoped the island housed tribes he could conquer, easily padding his resume with victories over an invisible people. Another insists that plans were drawn to use the island as a prison for political enemies' banishment, to a place that might not exist being the ultimate punishment. Absurd as these may sound, they reveal Rome's peculiar blend of pragmatism and imagination. The empire thrived on both logistics and legend, and the Phantom Island sat neatly at their crossroads. By the time the torches burn low in generals' tents, the Phantom Island has already served its purpose. It has sparked debates, shaped plans, and even inspired jokes. Whether it exists or not matters less than the fact that men with power to move legions pause to consider it. The island becomes a mirror for their ambitions, reflecting not reality but possibility. And in Rome, possibility was often enough to drive action. As dawn breaks and the camps stir, the Phantom Island slips back into rumour, carried on the breath of officers and the weary laughter of soldiers. Perhaps it is out there waiting beyond the horizon. Perhaps it is nothing but mist. But for a moment it has marched with the legions, entered the councils of generals, and weighed itself against Rome's ambition. That in itself makes it part of history, even if its shores were never touched. Storms roll across the Mediterranean, sudden and theatrical, and they have always held the power to alter history as much as any emperor's decree. Sailors of the Roman Empire knew this truth better than most their fragile wooden vessels, creaking under the weight of canvas sails and ambition. The Phantom Island, already a curious mark on Rome's maps, became wrapped in stories of weather that seemed far too deliberate, as if the sea itself conspired to keep humans away. Mariners claimed that every time they neared the place, clouds blackened. Winds reversed and lightning danced in a mocking semicircle around their ships. It sounded like the stuff of tavern exaggerations, and maybe it was, but such tales spread quickly, repeated so often that even the most sceptical captain began to wonder whether he was daring fate by aiming his prow toward that particular dot on the parchment. One mainstream fact steadies the tale here. Roman seafaring relied heavily on seasonal winds, especially the Etesian breezes that blew steadily from the north during summer. Merchants timed voyages with almost mathematical care, knowing that to sail against those winds was like trying to paddle upstream in a river armed only with spoons. If the Phantom Island lay in a stretch where those breezes faltered or swirled, unpredictably storms could easily ambush crews. Historians still argue whether the storms were simply natural squalls exaggerated into legend, or whether unusual local currents gave the impression of a cursed sea. Either way, the Phantom Island became less a geographic feature and more a meteorological riddle etched into Rome's collective imagination. The quirky bits, of course, are what really enliven the stories. One popular anecdote insisted that Neptune himself took offence at sailors nosing too close to the island, whipping the sea into a froth to keep them away. Another tale, more practical but no less peculiar, suggested that sulphurous smoke rose from the island's centre during storms glowing faintly at night, so sailors concluded that the land itself was alive. Some claimed the glow was volcanic, others swore it was the work of priests tending eternal fires. Either way, few crews wanted to test the hypothesis firsthand. After all, when the sea is throwing water in your face like an angry dog shaking off bathwater, it takes a very special kind of confidence or stupidity to keep steering toward an island no one else had ever managed to step upon. Picture the sailors in their cramped quarters soaked through and shivering, muttering that the storm seemed to have personality. They passed around flasks of sour wine, each man taking courage, in small sips and larger boasts. A helmsman might spit salt water and claim the waves formed shapes like serpents twisting around the bow. Another, perhaps more imaginative than the rest, declared he saw a colossal figure beneath the surface hands pushing the keel away from land. By morning the storm would pass, leaving sunlit calm but no island, just empty sea. And that emptiness, more than the lightning, more than the bruises from flung rigging, was what unsettled them most. Mainstream Roman practice added fuel to the superstition. Pilots often relied on coastal landmarks and star patterns, not compasses, to find their way. Clouds from a sudden storm could wipe the stars from the sky and smother any chance of navigation. A few hours of confusion might send a vessel leagues off course. Thus, if a ship thought it had reached the Phantom Island's coordinates only to be shoved elsewhere by winds, the logical conclusion was that the island itself had slipped away. Logic in this case wears a very loose toga. Historians still argue whether repeated storms in the same region might have seeded this legend, or whether the Phantom Island was always an excuse sailors used to explain why they returned late and cargo light. One joke survives from a later chronicler, who dryly wrote that the Phantom Island's greatest export was excuses. Captains blamed it for delays, merchants for losses, and even soldiers for desertions. The storms gave everyone a convenient scapegoat. The sea itself turned me back, they could say, shrugging dramatically, and no one in Rome could easily disprove them. Still, it wasn't only jokes and jests. Senators listened to these storm stories with unease. If the island did exist, and if the gods truly guarded it with tempests, perhaps something inside was worth guarding. Treasure-forbidden prophecies, a lost colony, the possibilities glittered brighter than the lamps flickering along the Senate's corridors. And if storms were merely natural hazards, then perhaps better ships, stronger sails, or more determined crews could solve the mystery. Either way, the island's legend grew each time thunder rumbled over the Mediterranean, each time a mast cracked in the night. The paradox of the Phantom Island storms is almost poetic. Sailors who most feared the weather were also the ones who spread the tales most enthusiastically, ensuring that no Roman dinner party lacked a juicy anecdote about Neptune's wrath. The empire thrived on spectacle, and what better spectacle than nature itself playing gatekeeper to a secret land. Children leaned forward wide-eyed as old sailors waved their scarred hands, describing lightning that split the sky into jagged scrolls of fire. Wives shook their heads knowingly, half convinced their husbands were inflating their courage. But every retelling chipped away at skepticism until storms and the Phantom Island became inseparable in Rome's collective memory. And so the Phantom Island endured not because anyone proved it real, but because storms made it unprovable. Each voyage that ended with battered sails and no landfall was one more testimony to its existence. To the Romans, this was almost worse than having no legend at all. The sea dangled possibility in front of them, then snatched it away like a mischievous child hiding figs under the table. And as long as the storms came and went, the island would remain out of reach, half seen, half believed, but wholly alive in their stories. The rumour of the Phantom Island refuses to die quietly. By the time the 2nd century unfurls its scroll of emperors and wars, the mysterious land first whispered about in earlier maps begins to acquire strange, almost theatrical embellishments. Poets write of it in verses that mingle geography with allegory, comparing it to a bride glimpsed through a veil, present, enticing, yet never truly touched. Orators use it as a metaphor for promises made by politicians, alluring on parchment, impossible in reality. And all the while, cartographers continue to ink its outline, careful to leave its borders vague enough that no navigator can be accused of outright falsehood. It exists as a hazy silhouette, a kind of geographical ghost hovering at the edges of empire. Historians still argue whether these embellishments were acts of deliberate invention or simply the inevitable creep of myth into memory. Some maintain that once an island is mapped, pride resists erasing it, for erasure feels like admitting defeat. Others point out that Romans had a talent for transforming uncertainty into moral lesson, so the island may have become less about cartography and more about cautionary tale. Either way, its persistence speaks volumes about the Roman imagination. Here is a people who built aqueducts across valleys, drained marshes into farmland, and raised monuments higher than trees, yet they could not resist cherishing the idea of a land that forever receded from reach. Among the quirky tidbits preserved in later anecdotes is one about a senator who supposedly wagered a fortune on whether the island would ever be found. The bet was recorded, and decades later, when his descendants tried to collect on it, they faced the obvious problem: who was qualified to declare the search concluded. The dispute, absurd as it sounds, ended in the Senate itself, where a magistrate dryly ruled that an island which has not been seen cannot be considered absent. It is the kind of logic that makes one wonder if Roman lawmakers were moonlighting as comedians. At the same time, mainstream fact offers a firmer anchor. Roman commerce did indeed stretch across the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. They knew the Canary Islands, for example, which were described by Pliny the Elder as rich in dogs, so numerous that they supposedly lent the islands their very name. Sailors brought back tales of strange plants, birds, and volcanic landscapes. If such distant islands could be reached, why not another one a little farther west? This factual backdrop gave rumours about the Phantom Island just enough credibility to keep them alive, even when scepticism should have smothered them. In the taverns of Rome, the island became fodder for sleepless chatter. Picture sailors hunched over cups of sour wine, swearing they had glimpsed land beyond the sunset, but turned back because provisions ran low. One man claimed to have seen smoke rising from its hills. Another swore to hearing dogs barking across the waves. Were these genuine memories or the inventions of men eager for free drinks? The audience rarely cared. The story itself was the entertainment, and the more impossible it sounded, the more listeners leaned in. Meanwhile, in private villas, wealthy collectors displayed maps with the Phantom Island etched delicately near the edge. These maps were not just practical tools, but symbols of status proof that their owners were tuned to the latest whispers of discovery. Guests would pause before such maps, tracing the faint line of coastline with a fingertip, then turning to their host with the inevitable question, "Do you think it is real?" The host, of course, would smile enigmatically, for certainty was far less valuable than mystery. Even Roman generals seem to have played with the island as metaphor. One oration survives, though perhaps distorted through centuries of copying, in which a commander compares chasing elusive victory to seeking the island that dances with the horizon. The line suggests that the Phantom Island had by then entered the cultural bloodstream as shorthand for impossible pursuits. Just as today someone might speak of chasing a rainbow's end, a Roman might have shrugged and said, "We hunt the island." Yet beneath the jokes and metaphors there lingers an undercurrent of unease. If the island truly did not exist, why did so many sailors swear otherwise? Were they all liars? Or had they glimpsed something real that later vanished? Volcanic islands, after all, can rise and sink, dramatically born in a plume of lava and lost again beneath waves. Historians still argue whether the Phantom Island might have been one such fleeting landmass, present for a generation and gone the next. The Mediterranean world may not have known tectonic plates, but they did know the earth shifted and cracked unpredictably. Another angle worth considering is the psychological one. Romans, like all people, hated unfinished stories. To have a coastline begin on one map and vanish on the next gnawed at the imagination. It was easier to maintain belief than to embrace absence. A story once told becomes difficult to unsay. The Phantom Island, then, was less a place than a narrative momentum too powerful to halt, and so the island endured, inked onto maps, whispered in taverns, and embroidered into speeches. Its resilience lies not in geography, but in human stubbornness, the refusal to admit that something once described might never be found again. It is a stubbornness we still share when we chase after lost cities' hidden treasure, or emails we swear we saved but cannot retrieve. In Rome, that stubbornness was given form a faint line of coastline sketched by quills, defended by rhetoric, and immortalised by rumour. The Phantom Island may never have fed a soldier or housed a temple, but it fed something else, the human hunger for mystery. And as centuries turned, that hunger would ensure the island lived on, not in the sea, but in the restless minds of those who dreamed of distant shores. By the time the rumour of a now-you-see-it island west of Iberia had drifted from forecastles into salons and verse, its fate no longer rested on Storm's visions or oaths at the prow. It rested in quieter rooms, archives that smelled of leather and salt, and on tables where scribes nudged lamp flames away from papyrus. Here the island survived not by thunder, but by habits. Cautious, well-meaning, and profoundly human. Picture a records room in Ostia. Shelves hold wax tablets, lead tags, ship lists tied with coarse twine. Each roll is a voyage speaking in numbers and nouns courses, by star casks of water crews and rations, remarks on currents that tug like mules, and sometimes wedged between totals and dates, a sentence that resists being practical, land seen at dusk could not approach. A log was meant to guide provisioning and routes, yet when stored it shifted identities. It became evidence adoptable by mapmakers, who prized any datum with a compass rose hidden inside. Evidence is stubborn because delete means decide. A clerk unrolling a damp-edged papyrus does not remember the squall that blurred the horizon. He sees a line that says someone saw something. To strike it out would be to accept responsibility if a later fleet stumbles on a shore and asks why the note was erased. Better safer kinder to posterity to copy forward with a small hedge, a mark for doubt, perhaps a Latin word that keeps the claim on probation. Copyists were the island's most loyal weather. They were not philosophers, they were artisans of resemblance. Their oath spoken or implied was simple: make the new copy look like the old copy except perhaps a hair cleaner. If a dotted oval floated in the Atlantic on the exemplar with a margin gloss that read, "Said to be seen beneath a red sky," the craftsman faithfully dotted the oval again. To be virtuous he might append incertum uncertain, so conscience could sleep. Thus caution itself became a preservative like salt on fish. Occasionally fire curated the past in its own style. A shelf in Puteoli charred, and with it the boring but essential parts, numbers, bearings, altitudes by star. What survived were the lyrical edges the sailors claimed that a coastline breathed and vanished. The quartermaster's aside about birds wheeling from nowhere. Generations later, a scribe bent over these survivals and could only conclude that something had been there because something had been said. Gaps do not merely erase, they beckon. Imagination is a solvent that loves to fill the seams left by flames and mildew. Another small machine of memory was the margin. A copyist unwilling to interrupt a clean field of ink would paste a sliver of commentary beside the drawing "Fisherman of Gades," Reportland sometimes glimpsed. In the next generation, a different hand tidier, or in a hurry, folded that sliver inward, regularizing its voice into the main text. With each iteration, the whisper became a sentence, the sentence a feature. No proclamation announced the promotion. The island simply drifted line by line from rumour to fixture. Petitions from harbours also hauled the island along. Captains and factors seeking subsidies preferred a graceful cause to a graceless admission. We mistook Canopus persuades nobody. The phantom coast retreated before us is a story that spares pride while sounding like weather's fault. Those petitions were archived, and filing cabinets are generous. They do not grade motive, they only keep paper. Much later, a cartographer ransacking the stacks for Atlantic notes found a thicket of such phrases sincere or strategic, and the dots on his vellum seemed suddenly prudent. Consider, too, the three-generation parable of a map. Generation 1 draws a barely there island, fences it with dots, and adds a label said to exist. Generation 2, trained to respect forebears, redraws the same, but adds a fashionable device of the day, a fog rim to indicate doubtful shore. Generation 3, chasing legibility, prunes phrases, but retains shapes. The hedgewords fade, the oval remains. No one intended deceit. Each person obeyed a different virtue, fidelity, clarity, elegance. The sum of those virtues is permanency. The island graduates not by proof, but by polish. Reports that denied the island had trouble breeding. A negative is poor at illustration. A captain may return with close-drawn charts of currents and still write no land found. In copy after copy, those tidy denials compete with a single, lively mark on the map, a small shape that catches the eye even when the mind knows better. Our collective memory, like a gallery, favours canvases over vacancies. Absence is correct and uninteresting. Presence, even qualified, is a spectacle on parchment. Aesthetics also served as a quiet accomplice. Full maps felt truer than sparse maps, the way a crowded marketplace feels more like a city than an empty square. A draftsman hesitated to delete a feature however dubious, because a deletion created white space that made the whole ocean look underdescribed. The Phantom Island became an ornament that solved a compositional anxiety. It filled a silence. It kept the Atlantic from yawning too wide. Precedent that shy autocrat presided as well. Once a respected chart bore the island, anyone omitting it risked inquiries that sounded like accusations. By what authority did you correct your betters? Deference to pedigree is another name for fear of isolation. The island thus wore the cloak of reputation. To remove it required not only evidence but bravado, and naval bureaucracy rarely promotes the boldest eraser. Yet there was a nobler side to retention. Roman knowledge, conservative but curious, made room for annotations that were effectively invitations. Said to exist is a door left unlocked for future ships. A map records possession, but it also records questions. To keep a doubtful feature was to plant a small standard on the shoreline of ignorance, a promise to return with better eyes. The dotted oval did not merely dazzle, it tasked. Beneath all this lay the arithmetic of institutions. Knowledge travelled through choke points, archives, scriptoria workshops. At each point the safest behaviour was continuity. Continuity moved salaries, spared reputations, and synchronised new work with old inventory. The island rode those conveyor belts as comfortably as amphorae do river barges. When the chain occasionally snapped flooded storeroom worm-scrolled parchment, the surviving nodes tightened their grip on whatever fragments remained. Loss paradoxically hardened the profile of the thing not yet found. Even the language of uncertainty once ritualised began to harden. Copyists came to favour familiar hedges, furta dicitur incertum, until the words felt less like warnings and more like labels, almost genres. Readers learned to glide over them as over gilded borders, pleasant expected, not decisive. The island lived in that glaze. It was neither confirmed nor banished. It was curated, tended by customs that mistook persistence for prudence, and display for neutrality. And so at the western margin of Rome's learned paper, the small oval endured. Not because anyone swore on Jupiter that it existed, and not because skeptics were silenced, but because 1,000 reasonable acts converged into an unreasonable longevity. A hearthfire's lick, a clerk's caution, a copyist's taste, a patron's pride, a bureaucrat's aversion to lonely decisions. These were the true winds that kept the island in sight. The ocean outside battered hulls. The ocean inside the ocean of organised memory polished an uncertainty into a feature. From here the path into our closing movement is plain. Once a doubtful detail takes root in the mechanics of copying and the theatre of authority, it ceases to be merely geographic. It becomes useful. On the page, utility can outlive reality. That is why the island's afterlife on maps, its scripted presence at the edge of empire, will matter in the end as much as any rock jutting from the sea. In the final section, we will watch how that presence continues to do work long after the sun has set on the original sighting. By the time the rumour grows grey at the temples, the Phantom Island no longer stirs only sailors or senators. It lives in the quiet habit of drawing. Scribes keep copying maps because copying is what preserves Rome, and each copy preserves the same small crescent of coastline hovering west of Iberia, like a thought someone forgot to finish. Erasing it would be an admission, a confession that the empire once inked a certainty that never was. So the line stays softened by cautionary notes in the margin said to exist. Reported by mariners, seen at dusk but still a line. Cartography becomes choreography. When the pen pauses at that latitude, every mapmaker in every generation performs the same brief hesitation, then glides on as if nothing peculiar just happened. Mainstream fact anchors this stubborn choreography. Romans cherish great public maps, Agrippa's Orbis Terrarum displayed in the Porticus Vipsania itineraries, that stitch roads from town to town, and later copies like the long ribbon-like table we call the Peutinger map. Those artefacts prove an empire that loves to measure things in miles and milestones to turn distance into governance. Yet their edges always fray. Beyond the well-surveyed heartland, the confident grid loosens, little captions multiply, and sea beasts curl politely in the blankness as if to say here knowledge thins. Historians still argue whether the Phantom Island's persistence springs from clerical inertia, political drama, or repeated natural misreadings. Fog banks, volcanic plumes, cloud, mountains dress rehearsing as land. Whatever the cause, the effect is steady, the island endures on paper, because endurance on paper is often how ideas outlive facts. The island's usefulness, meanwhile, refuses to retire, Orators still lift it like a prop to tease rivals. You chase promises the way sailors chase that dancing shore, and merchants still invoke it when pitching bold expeditions with conveniently flexible budgets. A general fonder of pageantry than prudence orders a tiny laurel wreath sketched above the islet on his staff map, to encourage morale, which is a refined phrase meaning to encourage donations. One clerk invents a ritual for nervous captains: toss a slice of bread to the waves. If it drifts west, the island welcomes you. If gulls steal it, the gods prefer you home for dinner. Quirky, yes. But then again, Rome is a city that reads the future in bird flight and committee votes. The best scholars keep trying to split mist from mountain. They gather the reports birds with twigs in their beaks far offshore, a scent of damp soil on windless mornings, lightning strobes around a hump of darkness, and they tie them to comparisons that sound sober until you hear the strain in their voices. Perhaps the sailors glimpsed the Fortunate Isles from odd angles. Perhaps a submarine eruption raised a raft's worth of pumice that looked like cliff and forest. Perhaps the eye, exhausted by wave after wave, knits straight lines out of chop and names the pattern land. Historians still argue whether a genuine island briefly surfaced somewhere west of the Canaries, whether a known one wore a disguise of weather, or whether longing itself drafted the map. The argument persists because it is really three arguments wearing one toga about nature's tricks about human appetite and about power's need to narrate. The appetite part is easiest to feel. People then and now are allergic to endings without answers. A horizon that never yields turns minds into engines. They hum and heat and invent plausible doors in the sky. In courtyards, grandfathers tell small listeners that the island appears to the brave and hides from the greedy. In bathhouses, a mosaicist slips a single red tessera into a field of cool blue water. As a wink toward a night the sea refused to explain itself. In taverns, an old boatswain swears he smelled pine resin far offshore, a whole forest breathing, and the audience breathes with him, because mystery is a better condiment than garum. Three jokes always surface that the island's chief export is excuses that its governor is a fog bank who holds office for life, and that Rome would tax it heavily if anyone could just keep it still. The power part is more delicate. A phantom coast lets a speaker gesture at conquest without committing a cohort. It lets a minister promise grain without buying a ship. It lets a defeated admiral claim he was turned back by weather manifestly divine, which is bureaucratic for don't ask. The island gives everyone a rhetorical harbour, and yet to be fair, it also gives them a discipline. It reminds even the cockiest consul that passed the pillars the world resumes its own authority. A dot that will not cooperate is a tiny check on an empire's appetite to rename everything. In that sense, the Phantom is oddly civic. It teaches humility by refusing to be drafted. There is finally the quietest layer: how the island changes the map inside people. Sailors stand longer at railings, scholars leave a little more white space at the edges of their theories, generals glance west at dusk and let plans loosen for a breath or two. When a thing both might and might not exist, practice adapts. Captains add an extra barrel of water just in case. Librarians keep duplicate copies in distant rooms because absence is contagious. Parents tell children to remember that some stories warn by refusing to close. The empire remains an empire, taxes tallied roads, mended letters dispatched, but a soft caution threads through it like a seam. Mainstream fact intrudes gently once more. Roman ships, though, stout, were coastal thinkers, and their charts favoured ports over oceans. The Atlantic's Canary Current, the Etesians, the fickle fogs beyond Gibraltar could play cat and mouse with any crew. In that theatre, miscalculation masquerades as miracle. Historians still argue whether the Phantom Island is Rome's most elegant error, or its neatest truth and admission drawn in ink that some knowledge will never volunteer. Either reading suits the city that invented triumphs to dramatise returns. The island is a triumph of uncertainty paraded every time a quill decides not to scrape it away. So, the ghost on the map persists. It is too useful to contradict, too pleasing to forget, too polite to prove. It asks for nothing but a dot of ink, and offers in return the service only mystery can provide. It keeps imaginations aerobic, it keeps power from growing smug, and it lets bedtime stories step out of history class and into the warm room where lamps burn low. Rome walks home at evening sandals, whispering over stone, and more than one passerby glances west without meaning to. Somewhere out there on water, or merely in thought, an uncooperative shore is still patiently refusing to be found. And now let the water grow quiet. Picture the western sky softening from bronze to violet, the long-backed swells smoothing themselves, until they look like miles of silk, thrown gently over a breathing giant. The ships that once chased rumours furl their sails and float as lightly as fallen leaves. The lamps in their cabins dim to a warm hush. Along the quays, voices fade from chatter to murmur to nothing at all, as if the whole harbour remembers to exhale at the same time. Let the phantom island step backward one pace, then another, not in anger, not in mockery, simply with the courtesy of a good story that knows when to give the listener rest. It turns from coastline into silhouette, from silhouette into mist, from mist into a thought that does not need proof to be kind. Somewhere a map rolls itself closed, somewhere a quill dries, somewhere a captain older now smiles at the joke of it and lets himself be small. Breathe slowly the way the tide breathes long in, longer out, until your thoughts begin to float like cork on still water. If a worry rises, let it drift past like a dark wave that never reaches the shore. If an old question tugs at your sleeve, tell it gently that tonight you are off duty. The sea will keep. The horizon will not move. The story can finish itself without you watching. The last sounds fade, a rope's soft knock against a mast, a gull's lazy call, the whisper of foam folding itself into sleep. Stars stand their watch above the forum and above the empty ocean, patient, unblinking, generous. Close your eyes and let that patience be yours. The phantom island, faithful to its role, keeps your secrets and asks for nothing back.